Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Greetings, I'm Dr. Christopher Jane Miller here on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. And more importantly, I'm here today with my faculty colleague, Professor Cogen Bohanec, who is the Assistant Professor of Jain and Sanskrit Studies here at Arihanta Institute, who I will be interviewing today to let you get to know Dr. Bohanec a little bit better. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Bohanec.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. It's great to be here. I appreciate you taking the time to interview me, and I appreciate the kind introduction there too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just as we get started here, we'll talk more about your academic work today. We'll talk about what you teach at Arihanta Institute, your research interests. But before we get into that, I want some of our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. A lot of people know who you are. They know you teach here. Some people may not know you. Who is Cogen Bohanec? Tell us a little about your background as a person, but also as a scholar. Like, how did you come into the field of what eventually became Jain studies for you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It's a pretty common question, particularly when I'm working with the Indian community and the diaspora. Everybody always wants to know, how did I get here? And I find myself wondering the same thing sometimes. Well, I had kind of a difficult childhood and adolescence. Came from a, kind of broken home, and I lived through a lot of violence. So violence has always been something that's been foremost on my mind. And trying to renounce violence and trying to eschew violence in my own surroundings, my own environment, but then also my own mind and my own body. That's been a very important preoccupation of mine for a long time. I guess when I was about 18 or 19, I started studying Gandhi very thoroughly. I read everything I could, every book I could on Gandhi, probably read a dozen of them or so at that time. And he kind of became something of a role model and a hero. I might even say a guru for me. And so I tried to really practice the type of tapasya, the type of asceticism and austerity that he advocated for. And I just got interested in that. So as I was doing my undergraduate, I also started studying yoga and practicing yoga every day, which led me to commit the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali to memory, probably about 25, 30 years ago, probably about 30 years ago, I guess I did that. So as I was practicing yoga. And I just wanted to really orient my undergraduate studies around that. So I was a history major, and I did a lot of work in South Asian studies, South Asian history. I wrote a lot about Gandhi and the independence movement. I also wrote a lot about social movements, burgeoning democratic social movements in the 20th century, and how they were inspired by Gandhian philosophy was a really big point of mine that I was looking at. I looked at the fall of the Soviet Union and how the solidarity movement in Poland helped inspire that, and how they were inspired by Gandhian tactics. I looked at apartheid in South Africa. And then, of course, I wrote quite extensively on the civil rights movement and its relationships to nonviolence, but also kind of challenging that a little bit by looking at the deacons of defense and some other sort of more gray areas within the civil rights movement. So that's really what I was doing. I studied Mandarin Chinese, and I just really was interested in Asian studies. I even started a master's degree program where I started to write a thesis paper on Burmese independence movement, that I was comparing the relative violence of the Burmese independence movement with the relative nonviolence of the Indian social movement, to sort of test the Gandhian thesis that the effect will be like the cause, Satkarya Vada, right? If you plant the seed of violence, then the result will be violence. If you plant the seed of nonviolence, then the result will be nonviolence. So it's a very, very, very big central point that Gandhi made. So if you're trying to have regime change and you do it violently, the result will be violent. We see this in Burma, we see this in Cuba, we see this in the Russian Revolution, even the American Revolution. The outcome of that was really not very it really wasn't a revolution. I mean, historians often will say it's not even a revolution. It was just a change in who had power, because it was just as violent as the regime that occurred before. So I was doing a lot of that. And so I was investigating in Burma, but the department I was in wouldn't support my Asian emphasis. And so I got discouraged. But my stepfather, who is Indian, he's from Tamil Nadu, and he was also a faculty member at UC Berkeley. And he said, in computer science, and he said he knew all of the people in the department in the South Asian studies there, and he would introduce me. And he asked me, what is it that I really wanted to do? And I'd already memorized the Yoga Sutra. I was studying Sanskrit on my own every day, just for my own interests. And I said, well, I really want to study Sanskrit. And he said, okay, well, I'll introduce you to the department. He said, but I'm really good friends with Padmanabha Jaini, right? With Dr. Jaini, because they actually lived close together, and they would like see each other when they'd walk to work together, you know, next to the campus, and they were really close. So he brought me in, and I met Dr. Jaini. And of course, I was well-versed in Gaudian philosophy and Jainism. And I was very inspired by Jainism. And I knew that he was, you know, it's important that we make clear that Dr. Jaini is primarily a Buddhist scholar, but he also did a lot of Jain scholarship too. I think that, you know, in honor of his spirit, he would want me to remind everybody that, because it seemed to be something he wanted to remind people of, because I think he got a little more renowned for his Jain scholarship. But when I met him, the first thing I said, and it was just very spontaneous, just right from my heart, I said, you know, will you teach me Ardha Magadhi, you know, the Jain Prakrit language that a lot of the Svetambara canon is written in, Svetambara Jain canon. And he looked at me and he said, it was so inspiring. Walking and meeting Dr. Jaini was like meeting Gandalf or something. You know, like I walked into his office. It was like Sunday afternoon at like 2:00. Of course, the department's dead, but there's Dr. Jaini in there with piles of manuscripts all around him in different languages. And I walked in there and I thought, wow, I want to be this guy, you know? And he said, I will teach you Ardha Magadhi if you learn Sanskrit first. And if I can take any Sanskrit book off of my shelf and you can read it and translate it, at that point, I will teach you Ardha Magadhi. And I said, okay. So I enrolled in Sanskrit, which I wanted to do anyway. And I ended up taking 5 years of Sanskrit at UC Berkeley with Robert and Sally Goldman. Also, my first professor there was Christy Wiley, you know, who's also a Jain scholarship. So I got a little bit of Jain influence through her as well, too, inspiration. You know, I thought it was just really great that people could be scholars in Jain studies. Ultimately, I didn't get into the program at UC Berkeley, the PhD program that I've been applying for, but Robert and Sally suggested that I do Buddhist studies at GTU, because then I could still do my Sanskrit at UC Berkeley. And they didn't have Hindu studies at GTU then. So I went and got a master's degree in Buddhist studies. I did a lot of like Japanese Buddhism, because it was a Jodo Shinshu run school. And I also ended up learning Pali. And so my master's thesis itself was a conversation between translation of the Pali Buddhist canon with similar literary themes and metaphors, you know, and even rhetoric in the Upanishads. It's very striking how close the various different metaphors and figurative forms of figurative speech are used in both of those categories of texts. You know, almost identical metaphors that mean something completely different to Buddhists than it did to the Hindu Upanishads. So I was very interested in all of that. And of course, I loved languages and translating. But there was no other program other than Buddhism at GTU at that time. So right when I graduated, I started looking at, you know, all these other South Asian studies programs. But then Dr. Riya Sharma, probably within a week after I graduated, I discovered that she was starting a Center for Hindu Studies, and I met her, and I was just hit it off great with her. She was very, very inspiring, and she really encouraged like more of a humanities approach, which I really appreciated, because I've always been very philosophically minded. You know, I'm a textualist, but much more than social sciences, I'm really interested in evaluating truth claims. Right now, I'm not like colonial in my orientation. I don't evaluate truth claims so that I can refute them and have some position that I believe that will triumph over all of them. I'm not that kind of, I'm actually probably technically not a philosopher per se. I'm probably more a scholar of history of ideas, because I've never studied analytical philosophy, which is predominant in the Western world, but I do know my way around the history of ideas, both East and West, pretty well. And I do a lot of comparative work there. So I really liked that she had that humanities approach. And then she started talking to me about constructive theology, which I found to be very inspiring because it's kind of like ethics, but it's kind of hard if you have an objective epistemology to do constructive ethics within a South Asian tradition. If you're not South Asian, if you're not from that tradition, or even if you're just a scholar who's objective, even if you are from those traditions. Like, on what basis are you going to say this is the right thing to do and that's the wrong thing to do if you're objective, right? Because ethics is value judgments. Objectivity is value neutrality. And I wasn't really interested in value neutrality, And again, not that I was really wanting to put ideologies, in a battle to each other. My starting point is assuming that these people from these traditions are much smarter than I will ever be. I mean, the scholars and the people who devised Buddhism, Hindu, Jain traditions, the main thinkers, I mean, you really get humbled if you really deeply investigate their work. The only response is humility, My orientation is to show how these are persuasive philosophies, to show the value in them as persuasive philosophies. So Dr. Sharma was really oriented around constructive theology. And so I started, working on and learning constructive theology. I also studied methodology very in depth during my PhD program. I took all of the PhD seminar methodology courses that were not required. I was only required to take one. I took 4 because I was really, really interested in methodology and where I sort of stand methodologically. And so I came out of that program with just a really, really broad understanding of what different types of scholars I could be and what kind of scholar I wanted to be. And during that process, Dr. Sharma introduced me to Dr. Parveen Jain, and I would say beloved co-founder and president of Arihanta. He's been a dear friend of mine for about a decade now. He was translating, actually you can see this book right behind me. This is a book called Jain Dharma by Acharya Sushil Kumar, who is Parveen's guru, and it's in Hindi. And so Parveen wanted to translate that and turn it into a book, right? But it was tricky, just going from the Hindi to the English, especially since Parveen is trained as a scientist, right? He did nuclear physics, and then a lot of his work was in technology and such. And so he was kind of looking for somebody who had experience with translation, which I did. I had a lot by then. And somebody who had experience with the sort of lexicon of South Asian studies and the norms of the field. And so he and I worked for about 5 years to produce this book. And it's funny because literally it's open on my desk right now. I did not stage this. This is how much I use this book, right? An introduction to Jain philosophy, which I helped edit and translate. And that got me really deep into Jain studies. And so when I graduated with a PhD in Hindu studies, I'd also had many years, probably about 5 years of research in Jain studies at that point, even though it's not technically on my transcripts, it's what I was doing. Parveen and I had a great working relationship, wonderful time. We would get on the phone and philosophize for hours. And I really learned a lot from him. He became a real mentor towards me. And I really, really am inspired by his devotion to his own Guruji, Acharya Sushil Kumar. And that sort of beautiful relationship there really warmed my heart, and I got so much out of it. When I graduated, he'd always talked about starting a school or something like that. It's not that I didn't take him seriously, but to me, it was just you think about things you can do, right? I didn't know that he was going to actually do it. And then a couple years, maybe a year after I graduated, he offered me a job at Arihanta Institute that you yourself co-founded, which I think was a really good choice to him reaching out to you. So that's my Genesis story in a nutshell. I hope that didn't take too much time. And I guess that wasn't a nutshell, was it?
Well, so everyone, that is the autobiography of a yogi, Dr. Cogen Bohanec. One thing we all appreciate about you, Cogen, is your clarity in thinking, and you are a philosopher. We consider you the philosopher on our faculty, and your ability to articulate complex ideas in a nutshell. And for a philosopher in a nutshell, sometimes it's not a nutshell, but it's okay. It was really, it's inspiring to hear your story. And part of what inspires me is, it begins with as so many people who come to these traditions, it begins with some suffering, some immense suffering, some experience of the fact that the world is full of suffering, which is one of the core, of course, foundations of all these dharmic traditions. And the problem, or one of the problems, as you so often say, the method of these traditions is to try to come up with an answer, to try to solve at least that and the solution to that and other questions of why we suffer, and is there a way to be liberated from this suffering. And your approach is very pandharmic. You cover so many traditions. As you just went through, your career has spanned 3 of the dharmic traditions in very close detail, as well as many other traditions, as we know. And you really have studied so much, both with regard to the philosophy and the doctrines and the scriptures of these traditions, the history of these traditions, their manifestation in current practice through Gandhi. And another element of your journey that I also find quite inspiring, as a kind of novice Sanskritist myself who enjoys translating really for the pure joy of Sanskrit and understanding the texts that I'm working with, one of the things that you really do so well is translation, is Sanskrit, is not just Sanskrit, but languages themselves. And you mentioned that a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about, as we transition here, I want to hear a little bit about your teaching, what you teach, because at Arihanta Institute, where we are now, where this great journey of yours has brought you, you teach South Asian languages. Do you want to say a little bit about your South Asian language teaching, what you teach now, what's coming in the future?
Yeah, languages have been a passion of mine for a long time. I haven't actually counted the list, but I think I've studied probably about like 12, 13 languages. It's a lot. I was also a college student for a very long time too. So it gave me a lot of opportunity to do that. My father spoke 7 languages, and I would go to Europe with him frequently as a kid. Once a year, we would go to Europe. And it was just great to watch him go from across. Every time he'd cross a border, he'd have a whole new persona, and he would speak that language fluently. You know, he was a refugee after World War II. And so that was like a survival skill, was to know all the languages, you know. And as a kid, you know, he had to flee communism in the former Yugoslavia in 1954. For him, the Cold War was very real, and it was a very, very real threat because he had been chased from his country because of communism. So as a child, he taught us Russian, which I never got like fluent at, but you know, the way he structured the grammar, and we memorized paradigms, and being able to sort of see the sort of overall structure of language was something that he imparted on me at a young age. And I would qualify that I don't believe I'm talented with language. A lot of people say that I have a language talent, and I will absolutely reject that. I do not have any talent. For many years, I was always the worst in my class. That was certainly the case with Sanskrit. I was definitely, I was at UC Berkeley. I was definitely the worst, but I also have more tenacity than most people, which if I had to choose between tenacity and intelligence, I think I would take tenacity over intelligence. But
just so our listeners know, Dr. Bohanec does 1,000 push-ups in addition to many other things in his morning routine. So speaking of tenacity, yes. Please.
Yeah. Every morning, 1,000 push-ups and 2 hours of meditation in the morning, and then twice shorter meditations throughout the day, every day for the Sandhya, for the division of the day. So as an undergraduate, I studied Mandarin Chinese and sign language. I studied Sanskrit. Then I learned Pali as well. I studied like 5 of the Prakrits. That was a short study, but I've been studying it kind of on my own for a while. Which are like Maharashtri, Saraseni, Paishachi, Chulika Paishachi, Magadhi, Ardhamagadhi, right? My aim is to learn Ardhamagadhi, right? So I study all of those. I was quite good with Pali for a while. So, but I've been studying Sanskrit I've been studying Sanskrit for probably about 25 years, you know. The first part of that was like self-study, memorizing the Yoga Sutra right off the bat, you know, like 30 years ago or whatever. You know, of course, I was learning vocabulary. I wasn't learning inflections and grammar or anything like that, but I learned how to read and write, and I learned a lot of vocabulary. It wasn't until UC Berkeley, maybe 15 years ago, maybe getting close to 20. I don't know when it was that I started at UC Berkeley, that I started really doing it formally. And then I did that for 5 years at UC Berkeley, but I still used it every single day. I still use Sanskrit every day. I memorize Sanskrit verses every single day, and I recite them. And of course, in the process, I analyze the syntax and the grammar and everything. So I use Sanskrit every day in that capacity. But as a scholar, I more so when I was in my PhD, as a PhD student, I was translating Sanskrit for hours every day because I did so much research and I translated, I don't know, hundreds of pages of Sanskrit text for that. So then when I graduated, I started teaching Sanskrit at GTU. And I taught Sanskrit for, I think, about 2 years there, maybe 3. And then I've been teaching Sanskrit at CST now for a year as well, too, through Arihanta Institute. We've kind of got our little areas of specialty. I think all of us have Sanskrit, animal studies, and veganism, and yoga. Like me, you, and Jonathan Dickstein, we all have those. But we also have these in a different emphasis. And so I'm kind of doing the language Sanskrit emphasis. I'm doing Sanskrit now. We're slated to teach Gujarati, which I'll be co-teaching with Venu Mehta. I'm currently co-authoring a Gujarati primer with Venu. I've been studying Gujarati for about 2 years, every day for about 3 hours, between 1 and 3 hours, sometimes twice a day. And then sometimes long stretches on the weekend, I'll study Gujarati. So Venu Mehta and I, who's also our colleague at Claremont School of Theology, she's an excellent scholar. I absolutely love her scholarship. She and I are co-authoring a primer on Gujarati, and we'll be teaching that primer in the fall of 2025. A lot of what I'm doing now is research on Srimad Rajchandra, who is a Gujarati Jain saint, Acharya. And he has a prolific writings in Gujarati, and they're very, very beautiful. So I've been doing a lot of translation of that. I also taught courses for my translations of his Atma-Siddhi Shastra at Arihanta, which one can find available on our Arihanta website. And I also taught 2 classes on his Mokshamala, where I read a lot of the Gujarati in that, and I've used the translations, but I didn't use those translations when I was teaching. So I've been working with Gujarati a lot. I've also studied a bit of Prakrit, Jain Prakrits. The good news is that Ardha Magadhi, the one that I'm mainly interested in, is much closer to Sanskrit and Pali than the other. Like Maharashtra is probably about the farthest from Sanskrit. They just have this strange predilection of removing consonants out of words in Maharashtra. But fortunately, those consonants are not as removed in Ardha Magadhi. So I've been working with Ardha Magadhi. I've been translating Ardha Magadhi for years. But I'm not great with it. But as I work with it, more and more, I'm developing the skill. I've reached out to Ghent University to study there as well. I'm always looking at ways to learn more languages and to hone the skills I have. But my goal is to, in the future, 2-3 years down the line, once I really have sort of finished things up with Gujarati, my focus will be on the Ardha Magadhi, writing an Ardha Magadhi primer. I want an Ardha Magadhi primer proper, not Jain Prakrit. I don't think people should have to study 5 languages to learn the one that they're interested in. So I'm really, really keen on developing a pedagogy that focuses exclusively on Ardha Magadhi, especially since it's the easiest of the 5 Prakrits because it's closest to Sanskrit. So that's sort of maybe a 5-year goal of mine. And then after that, I'll turn my attention to Hindi as well. I've had a lot of experience translating and reading and studying Hindi as well. Obviously I did a lot of that when Parveen and I were working on Acharya Sushil Kumar's work. But I've been working on it with Hindi for years. So I'm hoping to formalize the pedagogy for that as well too. There's a lot of great resources on Hindi, so I probably don't have to compose a primer like I do for Gujarati and Ardha Magadhi. But anyway, that's kind of what I'm doing I think the take home from this is that language is such a key research skill. If you want people to take your scholarship seriously, if you're doing your own Sanskrit and Prakrit and Gujarati translations, then that really brings the quality of your research quite a bit. And so in the peer review process, that's one of the things that peer reviewers will notice if you're doing your own translations, and that will really, really help our burgeoning scholars at Arihanta. And I think there's my other extended nutshell. So.
No, I'm really glad that you mentioned everything that you did. I mean, we really wanted to hear about your background in languages, what you're offering, what you're intending to offer. You, of course, have a research Sanskrit course available on our platform. There's a self-study course there for people if they want to dive into Sanskrit or review their Sanskrit skills and start doing that again. We have that on our Arihanta Institute platform. And the other thing you mentioned that maybe I'll get a little bit of clarification for here is you brought up Claremont School of Theology a few times, CST, you said. You were talking about Professor Venu Mehta. I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning, but we have a collaboration, of course, with Claremont School of Theology to offer a master's degree in Engaged Jain Studies, which is a program that's currently running with a number of wonderful students who are studying Jain studies and allied fields of inquiry, including Sanskrit, of course. And then, of course, other things like we have a concentration in veganism, animals and ecology. And the other one that's more tied in, I think, with this conversation that we're having is our concentration that is offered through this program in yoga studies, and a particular focus on yoga in Jainism. And as I think about that, and as we have students taking these courses to fulfill these requirements in our program, we also recently had a conference, Yoga in Jainism, that was organized by yours truly. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what that conference was about, and a little bit about where people can watch the recordings?
Yeah. So that was our second annual Engaged Jain Studies conference, and the theme this year, 2024, Yoga in Jainism, right? And we focused on a lot of different aspects of the Jain yoga tradition, the lived tradition, Jain ethics, textual studies in Jain yoga, embodied Jain yoga, because of course, Westerners, when they think yoga, they immediately think physical, but of course there's so much more. But we definitely had some speakers speaking about that. Contemplative practices in Jain yoga, which is a passion of mine. I co-edited a book on contemplative Jain studies. And so it was really nice to have people speaking towards the contemplative aspects of Jain yoga studies, meditation, definitions of samadhi, various different other topics of dhyana, that sort of thing. And then comparative yoga traditions, which is actually like really a point of interest for mine. Of course, I presented on that panel doing a comparison between the Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra and its relationship to the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, which I've had 30 years experience with. And then also looking at Haribhadra's Yoga Drishti Samuchaya, right? But the comparative yoga traditions is very important. I think a lot of people get a foundation in yoga through Hindu yoga, like I did myself. And then sort of understanding Jain yoga in relationship and dialogue with that is very important. And actually, I use the term dialogue too, because I'm also authoring a book right now on Jain yoga. And I'm looking at it through the lens of pragmatism, a sort of William James type pragmatism, and how that facilitates interfaith peace building and dialogue. So anyway, I think the comparative aspect of that is really important. Of course, we had our dear friend and great colleague, and it's hard for me to even say colleague for somebody as superior to me as Dr. Jeffrey Long, but he's a great mentor of mine. And of course, he's always doing wonderful comparative work between the Jain tradition and various different versions of Advaita Vedanta and Vivekananda and that. So, of course, he was representing that sort of comparative. So those are some of the topics that we covered. And yeah, the conference, I think, is a great success. We have had such wonderful speakers, such notable people, but not just seasoned scholars. Of course, we had a lot of those, but we had people from within the tradition speaking as well, too, which I think is really important to provide that emic voice and not just let this be a purely sort of edict, outsider perspective, And then we also had some very promising burgeoning scholars too. I'm thinking in particular of Eileen Godard. She's an amazing scholar, and I'm really watching her develop and some of her work with great interest as well too. Also, Alba Rodriguez, she's another burgeoning scholar who's really promising and is doing some great scholarship. So yeah, we've had a very nice, just diverse mix of scholars, different experience, different relationships to the tradition, and yeah, it's really great. So I hope everybody gets a chance to watch those videos.
Well, we appreciated all your hard work on that. It's a lot of work, as every academic knows, or anyone who's organized the conference. It's a lot of work, especially to put together a theme and to be able to put together and organize the panels in such a mindful way. So we thank you for all the hard work, and you gave a lot of people opportunities to share their research in this burgeoning field of Jain yoga. Of course, yoga studies is a rather growing and large field, becoming a larger field, and Jain yoga is a sort of underappreciated area of research that you really helped us advance the study of. And so kudos to you for doing that. In addition to that, you do a lot of things at Arihanta Institute. You wear a lot of hats. You teach languages. You teach philosophy courses. You teach a whole bunch of things. Another thing, of course, that you do is research and publish. And I know you have a lot of publications. You've done a lot of publications. You have a lot of publications coming. We don't have time to talk about all of them. But there are two in particular that there's three in particular that I really want to hold up. You're welcome to talk about other things if you want. There's three things I'm curious to hear you tell us about. And I'll do them in maybe in order of what I know in terms of how they're coming out and your signed contracts. The first is your book on contemplative studies in Jainism, which is behind me here in blue, recently published with Routledge. The second is you've just signed a book contract, and it's very far along and almost complete, as far as I know, with Lexington for your own book based on your doctoral work. And then your third book is the one that you're co-editing with me, Engaged Jainism. Can you tell us a little bit about each of those volumes and what people can expect to find there, and what kind of contributions you're making both to the field of Jain studies as well as more broadly to the study of South Asian religions and philosophy?
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say working for Arihanta Institute is absolutely amazing. And there's so many things I love about working at Arihanta, but the support I get from my research is just outstanding. I mean, I've been incredibly productive in publishing, and I only take part of the credit for that. I really give a lot of credit to Arihanta Institute for really taking research seriously. So I think it really is turning into a world-class research institute just because of how well the research of the faculty is being supported there. So the contemplative studies in Jainism, that was really conceptualized by Dr. Rita Sharma, Purushottam Bill Moria. We're both faculty members at the Graduate Theological Union. Dr. Sharma was my advisor. She was noticing, so she had proposed a Hindu contemplative studies volume that was published, I think in, what was that, maybe 2020 or something. I wrote a chapter in that, and I also edited that, but just not as like an official editor, but I did just like some copy editing, right, on that. So the idea of contemplative studies is it's an academic field, but there's not a lot of voices of South Asian traditions in that field. And a lot of times contemplative studies gets sort of what we might call a Protestant bias, right? With the Protestant Reformation, there's the idea that we don't need somebody to talk to God. We don't need the Catholic authority to talk to God, that we can talk to God, through ourselves and our relationship with the Bible, much more personal relationship. And that developed all sorts of sort of ideas, contemplative ideas. I mean, there are obviously Catholic ideas like Ignacian meditation and other forms of Catholic contemplative practices, but also listening to the inner voice, the Quakers, and that sort of idea of contemplative practice, and also is being opposed to ritual. That's sort of a Protestant sort of idea, as the contemplative is sort of like the opposite of ritual, as a critique against Catholic ritual, which sort of really disenfranchises the ritual-laden South Asian traditions. And so trying to bring South Asian voices to the idea of contemplative practices, practices where you're sort of experiencing a sort of elevated state of consciousness, right? And of course we have like Soto Zen, just sitting, right? Eventually your mind will be clear, hopefully. There's also Theravada offshoots, like with Vipassana, they kind of do the sort of empty mind thing. And of course the Yoga Sutra does Yogascitta Vritti Nirodha, clearing the consciousness. So like that's there, and the relationship between Vipassana and Shamatha, in early Buddhist texts, that sort of idea of an emptiness, like a clear state of consciousness, is there in the South Asian traditions, but it's achieved through so many diverse ways, not the least of which is ritual practice, puja, right? And that should be considered a contemplative practice because it is a practice where you experience sort of elevated state of consciousness, but also austerities, reciting of texts, memorizing texts, various different bhakti practices. Several of our chapters in that Jain contemplative volume are on Jain bhakti, which is something that people don't really know much about. And so, there's sort of broadening the purview of contemplative practices to be more inclusive, or contemplative studies to be more inclusive of South Asian voices, including Jain voices, and then broadening the understanding of what exactly is a contemplative practice to include some of these practices of the Jain tradition and other South Asian traditions. So that's kind of what that book does. And I think it was really well executed. I think the authors were brilliant, absolutely brilliant in contributing to that. I really enjoyed every chapter in that, and I highly recommend it, not just for my own bias. Let's see, the second one, my Lexington. I wrote my PhD dissertation on a Hindu school of Bhakti. And so my upcoming monograph, which will be published in 2024 with Lexington, it's going to be out in just a matter of a couple of months here. We're in the final stages of production now. I'm looking at Bhakti Ethics, right? And this Hindu school of Bhakti that I looked at is very affective, right? About cultivating your emotional being as being part of the soteriological process. Rather than rejecting your emotions and putting them in a garbage disposal and trying to get rid of them, actually seeing the emotions as having a sort of divine source. And that part of your spiritual trajectory is to intensify and cultivate that spiritual being. And then I looked at, does that have ethical implications? Well, in the West, ethical discourse around emotions is mostly restricted to what's called emotivist ethics, where emotions are just considered like you're feeling around something. So when you say that's wrong, all you're basically saying is, ouch, that hurts. Like, it hurts me to see you in pain, right? It's not actually asserting the factual value of moral statements, right? Ethical emotivism in the West is just saying that this is how I feel around ethical situations. It's not saying those ethical values are factual. I like it, you don't. It's a matter of opinion. It's a matter of taste, preference. If killing an animal bothers me and it doesn't bother you, who's to say if it's right or wrong? Right or wrong is not an objective quality of the class of actions of hurting animals. It's just how you feel to it. So it's anti-realist. And that's the majority of ethical discourse around emotions in the West. Now, I'd done a lot of work with ecofeminism, feminist care ethics, and I'd really sort of tried to, I looked a lot at masculinism and attitudes of patriarchy towards emotions as being, just silly and trite and something that interfere with a superior logic, and all these different ways that if you define ethics in a certain way, men look like they're very ethical, but women look like they're not. Right. And it just so happens that the way we look at ethics favors a masculine, a male point of view and diminishes the ethical contributions of women. And part of that, there's a lot too, but part of that is emotions, the emotional. And I didn't like the idea that feminist care ethics, when emotions are discussed in feminist care ethics, we're sort of following this emotivist anti-realism, this sort of relativism. And that bothered me. So I wanted to be able to articulate a way that we can use our emotions as sensory perceptions for the ontologically real status, moral qualities of classes of actions. When you're saying, ouch, that hurts when I see an animal being harmed, that feeling is a sense perception of the actual quality of that class of action that's objectively real, that is wrong. And it just so happens in this particular Hindu tradition, when emotions are part of the emanation of the universe from the divine loving couple, the moiety, or the god and the goddess, it infuses things with emotional qualities, right? And so emotions are a sensory perception, and it's a way that we perceive the objectively real moral qualities of classes of actions, and therefore allows moral statements to be factual statements. So that's the Lexington book.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hearing that from you helps us understand, I think, a little bit about the final book that you're going to talk about right now. Wanted to give you a second to take a sip of water, which is our book, Engaged Jainism, which you can tell us more about, because this book really looks at the way, well, I'll let you tell us about it, but we're still talking about ethics in a way, and the importance of ethics in the Jain tradition, and much more, of course, as well. But, as my co-editor, I'll talk about it somewhere else. I want to hear from you. What are we doing here in this volume, Engaged Jainism?
Well, thank you for giving me the floor on this topic. I will say that first of all, this volume was really conceptualized by our very own Dr. Christopher Jane Miller. And you really had thought very, very deeply about this by the time you'd come to me. You'd sort of created all of these sort of like heuristic structures and ways of understanding engaged Jain studies. I was very impressed. And like Dr. Sharma, with her sort of complaint at the absence of South Asian voices in contemplative studies, you were sort of noting that, Jains are not really sort of given a lot of credit for their social engagements, and we have this whole field of engaged Buddhist studies, and you seem to be like, hey, I'm speaking for you. I'll answer with your words. The engaged Buddhist studies had been such a developed field, and why couldn't we do something the same in Jainism? And when you brought that to me, of course, I have a Buddhist background. I got a master's degree in Buddhist studies, and it really hit me. It's like, yeah, this is a real need here. And the other thing that bothered me is I remembered back to, when I was an undergraduate, and I would hear my professors talk about the Jain tradition as these people who just go hide in caves and live as ascetics. And there was always this very sort of critical sort of tone towards the Jain tradition as being just more or less irrelevant because people are just kind of hiding off doing asceticism. And what does that got to say for the rest of us? It's even sometimes suggested that the Buddha was rejecting Jainism. I've had professors suggest that, he was rejecting that sort of, disengagement, and it's the stereotype that an ascetic tradition is, worldly denying and therefore is disengaged from the world. And that's just it's just such an unfair representation of the Jain tradition. First of all, it probably wasn't 90, I'm not the social scientist here, but 99% of the Jains are laity. They're very much engaged in the world. And they're doing so in ways that uphold and reinforce and affirm their Jain values. So how are they doing that? And in particular, the Jain community is, a lot of the voices that we're hearing in the Jain community are really wanting to show how their philosophy really has a lot to say about today's problems, and which is really what's happening with engaged Buddhism, right? It's usually engaged in some forms of social progress, the anti-casteism of Ambedkar, if we can call that the genesis of engaged Buddhism, which some people do. Certainly the term was probably coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, and that kind of started with his sort of anti-war work. And then we've seen engaged Buddhism get applied to, environmentalism, animal ethics, pretty much so trying to, really start articulating ways that Jains have been engaged in the world, they're currently engaging in the world, and how they can have voices at the table when it comes to dealing with our shared collective problems in the world today. And that's the book. We've edited a lot of it now. I mean, gosh, we've edited it probably over 3/4 of maybe 80%. And these chapters are just excellent. It's such a privilege to be able to edit something like this because I get to read every chapter 2-3 times and really internalize it. And some of the work there is just really excellent. So I really applaud you for being the visionary behind that. And I'm really grateful to have been part of that project.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's good to hear just kind of upfront and candidly your role and take as the co-editor on this volume with me of what you see happening in that book. It's very interdisciplinary, as you know. It has philosophical approaches. It has social science approaches. It has historical perspectives. And you and I are kind of ushering that all together into something that I think is cohesive, and you'll probably say. So I want to say that, of course, Arihanta Institute is always happy to support the research of our scholars. And Dr. Bohanec is certainly a prolific scholar in our institute. I congratulate you on your book. What is the title of your book again?
Yeah. We've changed. Actually, the editor or the publisher just had a wonderful title that they came up. And let me see if I can pull up the final, our tentative final.
Okay. Maybe you don't want to share it with us.
Okay, so it's Bhakti Ethics, Emotions, and Love, and Gauḍīya Vaiṣṇava Metaethics. Metaethics being the metaphysical grounding to justify ethics as factual statements. So
that's wonderful, and it's hard in academia at times to do this kind of constructive work. It's often times when you're in graduate school, you're even told not to do these things. You're encouraged not to do these things, and yet many of us come to the field of religious studies, even as broadly as we want to think about that, because, as you said at the beginning of this podcast, we've sensed the suffering in the world, we've sensed the suffering within ourselves, and somehow we want to make a difference not only for ourselves but for the world. And I think a lot of what your work does, very constructively but very precisely and academically, is allows and creates a space for scholars to kind of write and do so with Dharma traditions, with the Jain tradition, in a way that is very engaged with the world. So I really appreciate that about your work, Professor Bohanec, and it inspires me. And I know there's a lot more coming, so people can be on the lookout for your book, for all the other publications that are coming from your way. And I also want to, as we're drawing sort of to a close here, ask you if there's anything else you want to share with us about yourself, about your work, anything I didn't ask you. Feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the easy thing to mention is the sort of things that you can look forward to in the future from me. And I'm writing 2 other books as well on the Jain tradition. I mentioned the Jain yoga book, where I look at pragmatism, kind of a William James type pragmatism, and apply that to Jain interfaith dialogue and peace building in several yoga texts. And I'm also working on a book about Srimad Rajchandra. I'm very, very fortunate that one of the founders of our institute, Pramod Patel, is a great disciple or devotee of the Srimad Rajchandra tradition. He's been really mentoring me and teaching me a lot about that tradition, and I've had a lot of firsthand experience with that tradition with him. And I'm basically it's a loose biography. It's sort of following his life, and then different ideas that sort of in his writings, very philosophical ideas that sort of follow the trajectory of his life. It's kind of interesting in that way. It's not a biography proper, but it's sort of this sort of intersection about like understanding who he was as a person and how those teachings came from that, and really, eyeing that through the textual studies, the translations, reading and translating various different commentaries on his work, and then also, the language of, philosophy of religion. So that's what's coming up. Hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll see those. And Parveen Jain and I are also authoring a book together. And he's got these amazing transcripts of lectures from Acharya Sushil Kumar, his guru, all talking about mantra theory. And so he's translated that, and we did something very similar where we've turned that into a polished manuscript, based on those translations that he did. And I'm writing we're calling it an introduction, but it really is kind of like a framing for the whole work, where I discuss in depth Jain philosophy of language. And I'm doing that in relationship to 2 Hindu philosophies of language, Spotabhada, Varnavada. The question is, how is it that Jains can have their philosophy of language and expect mantras to be efficacious? Like, mantra efficacy is very much what developed Hindu philosophies of language. But Jains have a very different approach to philosophy of language, and yet they still are able to say that mantras are efficacious. And so that's really the research question behind that. Sorry, Parveen Jain and I are working on that. That one's going to be coming up pretty soon. I think we'll have it definitely done and proposed to a publisher by the end of this year. DK Print, it looks like. So probably 2025 publication on that one. So sorry, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that one.
I'm actually really glad that you did mention that. I've had a peek into it with Parveen a few times. Our Parveen Jain, as Dr. Bohanec mentioned, is our president and CEO at Arihanta Institute. And I have had a few peeks into the manuscript just to see what you all are up to. And that's very exciting work as the field of the study of mantra grows in this, Ellen Goff has the book Making a Mantra, has taught a course for us on that. It's becoming an increasingly important field of study within the study of South Asian and Dharmic traditions. So this will, I'm sure, be a wonderful contribution to Jain studies, as well as even more broadly to those who are interested in the study of mantra. There's a lot coming from you, and we really appreciate it. And it's hard to believe how much you produce. But I will say that, returning to this topic of discipline and tenacity, that students will be inspired by you, and they are inspired by you in your teaching because of that discipline. And of course, it takes that discipline in any Dharmic tradition Discipline is the core of almost anything that you do. You have to have discipline in order to come to the insights, come to the wisdom, come to the knowledge. And I do take personally a lot of inspiration from you, watching you, all the work that you do, reading about the work that you talking about the work that you do with you. So thank you for joining us on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. And we will look forward to seeing all the wonderful things that come from you soon, Professor Bohanec. I'll say to you, Jai Jinendra, and we'll see you soon.
Jai Jinendra, thank you very much, Dr. Christopher J. Miller. It's been a pleasure having you interview me. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.